are a number of questions hanging over the sentencing of Alex Ruda-Cabana later this morning. Axel, I beg your pardon. He can't get a whole life order because he was only 17 when he murdered those little girls. So the judge is going to be forced to determine a minimum term before he's considered for release on parole. So the families are going to be watching this like hawks, and they're going to be very, very tense about it. What are the options for the judge, in our view?
I think he's got quite limited range of options because, as you say, Axel Ruda-Cabana was 17 when he committed the crime, so he can't be sentenced really as an adult under our law. And I think, as you say, it's very, very politically charged, very, very high emotions, appalling crime. So the judge will have to be very, very stern. But the problem, the fear, is that whatever the judge says in terms of sentencing won't be enough, won't seem like it's just for the victims of this appalling crime. And that, I think there'll be a tension there.
If it had just been a few weeks later, he would have been over the age
that was
of
my
18.
understanding, and it would have been much clearer.
And then, you know, because, I mean, an attack of this kind, if it had been committed by Axel when he was, you know, a couple of weeks later, 18, a whole life sentence would seem the just outcome, never being released. I mean, there are only around 70 whole life prisoners in the UK, and a lot of people will be watching and saying, as they do, a life sentence should mean life. But, of course, a life sentence issued under the rules that the judge is constrained by will mean that he will have a minimum term before which he can be considered for parole.
Well, let's see what the judgment is today. I mean, obviously, the judges have to operate within the guardrails of what the kind of rules are. I mean, I'm sure this will be weighing very... I mean, I'm sure we're not the only people having these conversations. I'm sure that the judge will be thinking about this very, very intently because of the public interest in this, because of the severity of the crimes. The other thing that I am particularly thinking about is we have had a number of high-profile cases where the perpetrator has refused to come up to the court.
Yes.
And I think if that is the case, I think that's something we should look out for. And if that is the case, that will add further hurt to the family as well, and will be really upsetting to the public.
Well, he's got form for this. It's not just not appearing before the court. Most of the pre-trial hearings and the pre-hearing when he pleaded guilty, he hid his face. He covered his face with his jersey or his T-shirt or whatever. And that, again, will be something which people will be looking at.
I remember in the last Parliament, we did actually look at legislation in terms of actually getting people who are going to be sentenced to actually appear as a mark of respect. I can't remember where we got with the legislation.
Well, we spoke... So this would be called Olivia's Law, this proposal.
That's right.
Because Olivia Pratt-Bell was murdered in Gang.
She was a 9-year-old
the 9-year-old girl. We spoke to her mum, Cheryl, this week on the programme.
Her mum, I think, was in Parliament yesterday.
She was meeting the Prime Minister because she says it's taken too long. And she and Olivia's aunt, Antonia, were very distressed this week because of the Southport case. Axel Ruda-Cabana had just pled guilty, so they knew he was going to be sentenced in the next couple of days, and it was so distressing to them that he might do the same thing. Not appear in court, so that the families couldn't look him in the eye and tell him directly the devastating impact that he'd had. And there is no penalty that is strong enough at the moment to compel him to come to court.
You know, this is something that, you know, it will be looked at and, you know, hopefully it will get cross-party support. But when you sort of speak to people in the profession, they say it's very difficult to know actually how to do this because if people really resist, then there's lots of, you know, how do you restrain somebody? How do you physically get them into something? But I think for many people, it doesn't feel like the criminal justice system is stacked in the victim's favour or the family's favour. It does feel... and I get all the rules and regulations, but I think to the ordinary person and to us sitting here, sometimes it feels like the perpetrator who's done the really terrible thing, that they have all the, you know, the rights...
Exactly.
But that's, you know, how the system has evolved, because what you're trying to protect is arbitrary government, arbitrary arrest. So there's the whole system is geared to protecting the defendant and, you know, innocent till proven guilty, all of that. But you're quite right. I think the balance isn't quite right.
Well, the mother in that particular case said to us this week that she would be perfectly happy. However much violence was needed, to drag that lad into court. At the end of a chain, she would be happy to see that. She would be fully prepared to witness that, because to her, the important thing is that the court exerts authority and that the defendant doesn't have the last word, the last say.
That's true, but the question is how much force? I mean, there will be defendants.
Well, you can arrest people. You can arrest people against their will.
You can, but dragging
them in police cars and put them in cells.
True, but dragging someone to court to appear at court at a certain time is challenging. Now, I agree with what we were trying to do, and I suppose what that happened was the early election meant that for whatever reason this legislation fell through, and then you've got to redo it the whole again, and that's why Parliament hasn't acted on it. But I still think it is an issue in terms of how you're going to get people into the right place at the right time.
I think we have got to reorientate our criminal justice system towards the victims and families, because I think, to the point you made, Susanna, it's bad enough when a loved one is killed in incredibly violent, horrible, distressing situations. When you feel, and I don't even know if closure is the right word, but at an absolute minimum, you want to be able to look that person in the eye. You want them to see the pain and the anger and the raw emotion that you're feeling. And if that is denied to you, it's just like a final insult. But when all this is said and done, we will know later today what is so important, I think, for all of us is there are still so many questions about what happened to this young man. Why did he go from a seemingly, happy young man into this incredibly dark...
I don't think he was ever happy. I mean, he was...
we saw pictures of him with,
He came from a troubled background.
I agree. He seems to have been disturbed from a very young age. 12 or 13
with the knives and he turning up to school with a hockey stick when the knife was taken away.
We also saw him on the Children in Need or whatever the things... But we have to... And the things that I really want to find out is what happened within the family. Because I know the dad stopped him...
The week before. From going into his form school.
I'm so curious to know, did the parents, reach out for help? What were the authorities? So, there are so many questions that we've got to dig into. And I know there's going to be this inquiry, which is really, really important. But there's so many questions we have to dig into.
And there are other issues which, relate to what the authorities knew when. Because if you remember, we were told very little about what the situation was. And then facts about the fact that he had the jihadi manual and ricin, the toxin, the fact that he had that in his possession, those facts only emerged later. And so there was this whole void of lack of information, which meant that people filled in that gap. And there were all sorts of rumours and misinformation that was being bandied about.
But you also have to be careful about not giving out information that could prejudice a future
Well, that was
trial.
the Prime Minister's line, but there was a window between...
It's just the line, it is...
No, but hang on, let me finish. I mean, there was definitely a window before the man was charged, before the boy, rather, was charged, and when he was apprehended, where my understanding is that you can actually give some information.
The trouble in that case, Kwasi, was he was under the age of 18.
Yeah.
And that was a legal constraint, because you're not supposed to identify an individual if they're under 18, and then that was overturned by a judge in this case. But that took a bit of time as well.
It was overturned, and I'm afraid, I mean, whether you like it or not, the fact that there was a lack of information meant that all sorts of people were saying things which made the situation worse.
But not all of that speculation was wrongly founded. I mean, some of the speculation at the time, we were hearing that there were links to terrorism, and that was being decried and saying there was no evidence for that. Well, actually, there was evidence.
Well,
I'm more on your line.
Just hang on a minute. I think we've just got to be really careful here. There were people going out saying he was Muslim. He was not. OK, so that was massive disinformation.
That he was an asylum seeker,
that he'd just come over on a boat. Hang on, you've had your say. That's, come on, play
Okay, the conch to you.
Don't worry, you get another say.
Don't worry, you get another go, you get another shot. There were people saying he'd just come over on the boat. That's absolutely not true. I also just think we have all got a responsibility, particularly people with big social media platforms, to not spread misinformation because it suits your own political agenda. This man is evil, this boy, now a man, awful, despicable, wicked human being. Now, on the terrorism thing, we have to wait and dig into it, and without fear or favour. If he's an Islamist terrorist, absolutely go for it. However, there is a new form of terrorism. I've interviewed many terrorism experts. He also had Adolf Hitler propaganda. He was obsessed with all kinds of genocide. There's a new kind of extremism where people are doing almost picking and choosing different bits from different ideology. So just be a tiny bit careful about just putting him in one box at this stage, because we don't know.
But the point I was making was that I agree with you. There was a lot of misinformation, and the misinformation was fostered by the fact that nobody said anything.
No.
You couldn't deny, or because nobody was saying anything. You couldn't say what the facts were because nobody said. So people made it up.
Well, the perception was that there was a cover-up going on. Now, there wasn't actually a cover-up as such going on, but that was a perception, a very dangerous one.
Exactly.
And look at what it led to.
But Richard, we still have to have sort of. We've just talked about the sort of rules that bind judges. We've just talked about the rules. You will know as journalists, they're very strict pre-sentencing and pre-court reporting restrictions, so you don't mess up something. Remember, Tommy Robinson actually frustrated a trial because of... So it's not that, there's a cover. And I think we just have to be... There's specific rules about why information is not given out early when all the facts haven't been established yet.
But I think, as the Prime Minister said earlier this week, we are in new territory now, and we do have to look at these things differently. And, of course, one of the things, we were discussing this at length yesterday, is access to knives.
Sure.
And now we have this horrible story of this poor 12-year-old boy.
Yeah.
God knows what that family
Yeah.
are going through this morning. And, again, we come back to the question of knives.
I think the access to knives is a very important issue. But the sad truth is that if someone wants to kill somebody, they will find a knife by hook or crook. Now, it's quite fair and reasonable to try and restrict access to that. But you're not going to abolish evil behaviour by restricting knives. And so you've got to look at the substance of it.
That you have to put in every obstacle.
You're right, absolutely.
Because we cannot throw our hands up and say, well, they're going to get it anyway.
No, I agree with you.
But in the case of this lovely boy, Leo Ross, we reported this time yesterday the fact that a 12-year-old had been stabbed to death, and that was tragic. When you see the photograph and you put a face to a death, whoever it is, it becomes so heartbreaking because then you find out who it is who's lost their lives. A lovely, bright 12-year-old, never got in trouble. Leo Ross, he was going home from school. This is in the Hall Green area of Birmingham. And, of course, the head teacher then pays tribute. A lively, happy young man. Many very good friends who absolutely adored him. A lovely, bright member of the school community. We're supporting the children at the school, she said, opening a book of condolence with the family's permission, and thoughts are with Leo's family and all of his friends. And, of course, we add our thoughts to those, and our heart goes out to them. Never got into trouble, says a little boy who was in the same class. Always attended lessons, always in school, loads of friends, just a quiet kid. What on earth is going on?
We need to know more about it.
Another child.
I know.
Another child.
It's appalling.
And a 14-year-old has been arrested.
I mean, I think we have got a devastating problem with knife crime in this country, particularly affecting young people. I mean,
in Woolwich recently,
absolutely,
14-year-old stabbed to death on a bus.
Well, look, I do a lot of work in my local area in Lambeth and Brixton on antisocial behaviour, and we have organised very big community meetings, and it is the mothers who come and take the microphone and say, every time that period from when my son gets on the bus coming from school to home, our hearts are in our throats. Is he going to make it off the bus? And I don't know all the reasons for it, and we do need to dig more into it. Is it poverty? Is it, I don't know, gang culture, whatever? There is a feeling that for so many growing young people that carrying a blade is an OK thing to do. And I don't understand how this has been allowed to happen. And we have got... And I feel like we are, we're not doing enough on it because it is something which is affecting so many young people right now.
I think Ayesha's absolutely right, but there are two issues. There's the issue in terms of accessing the knife on Amazon or wherever it might be, but also there's the wider social issue in terms of gang culture. What are the reasons, the underlying reasons?
And nobody seems to have an answer to that. Well, I was thinking about my own school days earlier. I went to a very rough school in the East End of London. There's a lot of violence in the classroom and in the playground and on the station platforms when we got the tube to and from school. A lot of serious violence, beatings up, people being kicked in the head, all the rest of it. There was no question of anybody producing a knife. No. I think if I were to take that entire community and bring it into the present day, half of them would be carrying knives today. And so what's happened? And nobody seems able to answer that question. Well, why do we have a knife culture that we didn't have before?
Because I think it's become really accepted in terms of that type of, particularly kids of that age, where they genuinely... And I have spoken to a lot of people in my area about what kind of prompts them. people have buy into the fact that if you carry a blade, you'll be safer. That's not true. If you carry a blade, you're more likely.
But it's like an escalation because the other people.
Knife inflation, isn't it?
But,
exactly.
but you also have a situation where I think, particularly as well for a lot of young boys in certain parts of the country, they don't have particularly strong male role models. It's almost like other people come in and fill that space. They get caught up with running drugs for people. Have some money, you can do this. They almost get part of a kind of little, I say gang, but almost like a tribe, a family, a kind of kinship, all that sort of thing. And that is a whole part of kind of taking people into the space as well.
The point about drugs, I think, is key, actually, because a lot of the gang culture is related to control of that particular trade or whatever you want to call it. And I think, understanding the dynamics of that feeds into the knife crime. And that's something you were talking about your, school days. The drug culture is very different now.
Yes.
And that's, I think, something that's driving the violence.
We have no idea whether that's in any way an element in the stabbing in Birmingham.
No,
I know
but broadly...
certainly in
But I also
parts
think one
of
thing we haven't
London.
talked about is all of this, which links back to the awful Southport case as well, is also the role of social media in all of this as well. Because I do think young people are losing... They're becoming... we know that violent pornography, we know violence, we know this kind of culture. It's kind of glorified across so much social media. It doesn't seem that there's any sort of restrictions on any of this stuff as well. And I think that's it's sending a signal on a very sort of subconscious level that this is how one behaves.
I think the internet and social media have a massive part to play. I mean, those didn't, when we were growing up in the 70s, 80s, just didn't exist. Whereas now, you can live your whole life in this virtual world. And there's all sorts of things and influences that
it's so violent.
Come in.
I think that for a whole generation of young men, boys going into men, there is a sort of normalisation of real violence. A lot of that is online.
That's right.
But it's not shocking. It's almost like this is a way of life. This is how you deal with things.
You're absolutely
And I don't know how we change it. I think and also I think that has a read across to pornography as well, which is affecting a lot of young men and young women as well. I think there is something. I don't want to sound all Mary Whitehouse, but I do think
Mary Whitehouse?
I do think there's something really dark that's happening in society right now, particularly with young people in terms of, and it is happening. It's in the palm of the hand, and there's only so much you as a parent, you can police. I know everyone says, the parents should do more. Kids are just getting unfettered access to some incredibly graphic stuff at such a young age.
The question of that is, you've identified the problem, and I think we all agree, but what do you do about that? Do you introduce some form of censorship? I mean, we've tried to do that with online pornography. But I think it's a very difficult issue.
So many malignant genies have emerged from bottles, and getting them back in again is going to be the devil's own job. Shall we talk about Prince Harry?
Yes.
It was a stunning victory, let's face it. Nobody was quite sure this time yesterday what the outcome was going to be, but it's an overwhelming victory with a nice fat cheque to go with.
I tell you what, I think both sides think that they scored a victory here.
I don't see how the Sun or whoever it was could say it was a victory. They've got to pay millions and millions of pounds. How is that a victory?
Because there was no court case.
True.
But they've had to admit for the first time that they were at it.
That they were in the wrong.
Yeah.
And they had an apology.
Yes,
I think it's a victory for him.
It's settled now. They don't have to worry about what might have come out in court.
That's true.
I think Prince Harry also can claim a victory, but of course, the Telegraph, for instance, reporting, well, he had to, stood down. He always said he'd carry on right until the last minute, and he didn't. He gave up.
Did he have any choice, do we think, given that, the amount of money that's reportedly on the table, upwards of 20 million, and the fact that the Sun gave a complete, unambiguous apology, which they had never given to anybody before?
I think it's a victory for him. But it'd be interesting to see what other newspapers, where they sit in this debate.
Well, like the Daily Mail, there's an action against the Daily Mail.
That's right. That's what I was thinking about. And I'm sure they'll come to some sort of agreement.
You think so?
I think so, yes.
I mean, I just hope that all of this can... draw, because there was clearly some really bad practices that went on, and I remember, I spoke about it in Good Morning Britain many years ago. I was asked by Prince Harry to come and do an event with him, and I had a long private chat with him, and he was talking to me a lot about the press intrusion in his life. And I remember we had a very kind of honest conversation, and he talked really rawly about how this press intrusion, he felt, had really ruined his life. He firmly believed it ruined his mother's life. He felt that...
Absolutely.
Well, killed her.
And you know, it was something. It was not just about the money. It was a very deep sort of personal thing for him, and I think it felt that it had left deep scars across his family and his behaviour patterns. So hopefully, you know, be able to draw a line under it. But I also think that, you know, I think hopefully the press have changed how they do things now. I think, you know, there was a very really toxic culture, and I think particularly around the royal family. I interviewed Sarah Ferguson about a year or so ago, and we're talking about just how hurtful it was. She had a pretty torrid time in the press as well. And I think sometimes, you know, we love stories about celebrities and royals and all that, but sometimes we just forget they are human beings as well. And yes, of course, they have a privileged life and they have a nice time and all this kind. But there comes a point where you can't just dehumanise them at every twist and turn and do everything to sort of get every bit of information.
I think it was very notable that the Sun mentioned Princess Diana.
Yes, I thought that.
I thought that. I mean, it's a long time ago now. I mean, she passed away, what, 97? Nearly 28 years. And I think it was quite touching and noteworthy that they mentioned her. And I think, as Ayesha said, you know, Prince Harry feels that his life has been totally dominated, if not ruined, by the extreme interests that the press, have shown in his private life.
Well, I always think the thing for me that really sums up Prince Harry is those incredibly moving pictures of him, that wee boy behind the funeral cortege, in that suit that's too big, a touch too big for him. And you just see, this is just a wee boy, and he's lost his mum in just an absolutely horrible way, and he gets no peace afterwards. You know, he just gets no peace.
He was only 13, I think, when it happened. So his whole life, in a way, has been overshadowed by this.
Absolutely.
Is this going to be taken further? Can you see a criminal investigation now as a result of this? Or do you feel like that is in the past, so this ends it?
From the newspaper's point of view, I'm pretty sure they came to a deal because they were worried about the knock-on effects in the form of a criminal conviction.
You mean things could have been said in open court?
I think so. I think so.
Lots can be said in an open court.
My sense is that they came to a deal
Yeah.
because they didn't want more bad stuff coming out about what they'd done.
Yeah. OK, Russian warships are nosing their way along the Channel, going up into the North Sea, very much inside British territorial waters. The government said to Putin, we see what you're doing, we know what you're up to, but what can we do to stop it?
Well, I mean, I don't think anybody should be surprised that this is happening, given how dimly Russia views. I mean, we are seen as a real kind of enemy by Russia because of our support, our correct support for Ukraine. But it's very troubling nonetheless. And I think what was interesting is that there's certainly been a lot of cross-party support for what John Healey, the Defence Secretary, has said. The tone that he has taken as well, a pretty tough tone, but there's been support from the Conservatives, the Liberal Democrats. But, you know, we are going to enter a very, very difficult phase, particularly in terms of if they are trying to sabotage our communications and our underwater cables and all of this stuff. What I'm really particularly looking at is, what is Donald Trump going to do next on this? Because I think, and people know I'm no huge fan of Donald Trump, but I will admit, you know, the ceasefire, and let's pray it kind of holds, in the Middle East has been expedited by Trump. There is no question about that. The question now is, what is he going to do about Ukraine to sort of
Well, he's thrown down the gauntlet to Putin, hasn't he?
He definitely has. And actually, the one thing that I mean, he's obviously very self-interested, Trump, whatever else you think about his policies. But I think I'm told that the one thing he wants is a Nobel Peace Prize. So that's the one thing, because Obama got one, and now he feels that he has to have one. So he's very directly motivated, frankly, in making sure that people come together. And he, as you say, he's come in. I think he did do, his team did work on the Gaza ceasefire. And now he's trying to, you know, knock heads together to bring some sort of resolution.
Well, he's threatened Putin, hasn't he?
That's
he said,
right.
Give me a ceasefire or I will sanction you.
Exactly right. So I think he is sincere for various motives in trying to bring about peace.
Well, if he fixes the Middle East and he fixes Russia-Ukraine, he deserves
a
Nobel Peace Prize.
Absolutely,
doesn't he?
Absolutely. If he can end some of, you know, this sort of bloodshed and slaughter, then absolutely.
Right, I want to talk to you about the Chancellor, as a former Chancellor.
Yes,
she's in a bit of a pickle because the Labour government came into power saying growth was their #1 priority. That doesn't seem to be paying off right at the moment. And now we have, proposals to expand our huge, biggest hub airport, Heathrow. Sure. And a huge number of senior Labour figures have voted against that before. Ed Miliband, presumably with his net zero zeal, doesn't want an expansion of an airport and all the flights that would bring and the effect on climate change. What's going to trump what? Is net zero priority or is growth priority?
So my views have been very clear on this. I represented a constituency, Spelthorne, which is directly affected by Heathrow. Many, many people in the constituency work in Heathrow. And I was always, frankly, for expansion because of the economic argument. Yeah. The real scandal about this is that we've been debating this for 22 years. The government white paper saying we should have a third runway came out in 2003, and that was 7 years before I got elected in 2010. And all the time I was the constituency MP, this issue was ebbing and flowing, but never resolved. And it seems to me that they're not closer to any kind of resolution.
Ayesha, if you want your economy to grow, you do have to build things.
Absolutely.
And that's going to be awkward.
Well, there are always things within government that are awkward, but I think the government has been really clear about building. If Donald Trump's mantra is drill, baby, drill, this government's mantra wants to be build, baby, build. Now, you say there's a few people internally that are upset about it. There are also lots of people who will be very pleased about this. The trade union movement will be very supportive of this because it means building, means jobs, it means construction, it means good jobs and things like that. So it's not quite as... I understand why you've picked up on that. And, of course, there will be...
Well, because so many of the Cabinet have voted against it previously.
Well, people can change their minds,
right.
Susanna. People can change their minds.
The Mayor of Manchester is saying, excuse me, forget about Heathrow, what about us?
Well,
we could do with another runway.
But the other group, I think it's worth just for your viewers to just clock. There's a new group of Labour MPs and they're like pro-growth MPs. They're quite a big caucus. Yeah. So I think they're going to be pushing
So with the government's majority, they should get this through. But I think it'll be harder and more difficult than we think.
Well, we will leave it there for now.
We will support them.
We will ask the government minister, who is in charge of housing, actually, this morning, and therefore building. We'll ask him.
Build, baby, build.
Yeah, and then we'll ask you what you think of him.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
We'll see you again before 9.
See you later.